chapter over here, chapter 7 of Brochos. We're on Daf Nun Amud Beis, page 50b. And we spoke about the law of a shamish being mitzaref, two groups. Can a shamish join together two groups of people that were eating? And so the law that we saw in our Mishnah was that if you have Beis Chaburos, Mishnah on page Nun Amud Aleph on page 50a, it mentioned that two Chaburos that ate together, if they see each other, they can join together for a zimun. If they don't see each other, then they're on their own. They each have to do a zimun on their own, and they cannot. They're not able to join together for a zimun. Now, the Gemara adds in this point that you could have a shamish be mitzaref these two groups together, and it would actually allow the groups to do a zimun as one. So in Shulchan Aruch, it deals with this in chapter Kuf Tzadik Hey and chapter 195. And it mentions that if you have two groups that eat together in one room or in two rooms, if some see the others, which means you don't need everyone to be able to see each other, but if some of them can see each other, they can join together for zimun. And if not, they cannot join together. But if they have a shamish, if there's one waiter that is helping out both of them, so let me just mute 1 second. So he can join them together, and that works as long as they intended to be together for their meal. In other words, they intended initially that they want to join together, they want to eat together, and for whatever reason, they're not able to be in the same room, but they planned on joining. Their goal was to be together. So because of that, the shamish then can actually make that work, make that halachically acceptable, as long as they intended that in the first place. Now, the Shulchan Aruch adds in that some say that if there is a Reshus Harabim, there's a pathway in between these two houses that people travel on, like a road in between the houses. So in such a case, they never can join together. And so this is the Mechaber, this is the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch continues. He says if they ate, part of them ate in the house, part of them ate outside. If the person who's leading the benching sits on the doorstep of the house, he is able to join the two groups together. It'll be similar to some see each other. So there is the concept we learned in the Gemara of the shamish, and here it mentions if the mevarech, if the person who recites the blessing can see both groups, he can join them together. And then it mentions that when they do see each other and they're joining together, somehow they're able to join together, they see each other, or there's a shamish. However, you're able to join together for a zimun, you have to make sure to be able to hear the mevarech, the person who's reciting the grace after meal. You need to be able to hear him, and in order to be able to join together, and that would be a necessity in order to join. Now, how much do you really need for the zimun to hear? So the law is that in chapter 200, paragraph 2, it says that if a person is going to interrupt his meal to answer for the zimun, so it says here that, so you have 3 people ate together. So as we learned in our Gemara earlier, that one person has to interrupt his meal for the other 2, even if he doesn't want to, he's got to. And he doesn't have to interrupt for the entire benching, but he only has to interrupt the mechaber, the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Cairo writes that he only has to interrupt until Baruch she'achalnu mishaloi uvtuvay chayinu, until that sentence, and then he goes back to his meal, and he doesn't recite a new bracha. He has fulfilled. He has done his zimun, and the Ramah adds in. Some say you should have to wait until the end of the first bracha, Hazanas HaKoil, and so is the minhag. Now, the question comes, so what do you do about if you wait till Hazanas HaKoil? Does that mean you fulfilled the first blessing of the benching, and would that exempt you from reciting that bracha later on? So that's really a discussion over here that, according to the Ramah, you have to wait, and where would you start the benching? So it becomes an issue. The Biur Halacha deals with it, and so on. But the point that I'm making from the point that I'm bringing out here is that how much does the individual who's not benching, how much does he have to listen to? He's got to either listen to the end of the zimun part or the end of the first bracha. And we see that repeated itself sometimes. So going back to the law that we were bringing from chapter 195, it says that they're joining together. You need to make sure to listen to the words of the Mavarech. That's referring to, according to the Mechaber, according to Rabbi Yosef Cairo, you need to listen to the Zimun part. According to the Ramah, that would mean you need to listen to the first bracha of the Zimun and hear it. So again, you're hearing from the...
Because, things happened here is that the payment didn't go through.
So what we have here is so the law is getting into the intricate laws. Getting into the intricate laws, the details, the technical laws of the benching. So we have these details that how can you join together? And so we learned a few things this morning. Now, number one is there can't be a road that passes in between these 2 houses. We learned yesterday about a shamish joining the 2 people together. We also learned yesterday of the Tosfos brings in this idea that it could be 2 separate houses. And we see that brought in Shulchan Aruch here. And that's based on this Tosfos that we learned yesterday, that you could have 2 houses joining together. And we learned a qualification to that now, that the Shulchan Aruch says that it has to be that they had in mind to join together from the beginning. That, in other words, that's a very important factor. It's not that they just happen to hear each other eating in the house next door, and they say, you know what, let's join together for a zimun. No, they had to have in mind that they're interested in joining together for a zimun. And we also learned today about a person who's benching. If he sees the two groups, he would be able to join them together. So we got all these qualifications to the rules. And the Mishnah Berurah here says that if they do enter together and plan on eating together, but they can't see each other, in such a case, the Mishnah Berurah wants to say that they cannot join together, even though they're in the same room. And they entered to eat together, but they don't see each other. Now, the shamish, who's the waiter, he does not have to even eat with them. He joins them by simply seeing them, even though he's not eating with them. And the Mishnah Berurah continues, and he says that it's this law about they had to enter to eat together. He says, what happens if they're in the same room, they see each other, but they didn't plan on eating together? They didn't sit down intending that they want to join, they want to be together. So he first says that from the Mechaber, from Rabbi Yosef Cairo, it seems that they cannot join. It's so crucial that they have in mind that they want to join together and sit together. But then he says that many of the Achronim, the later halachic rulings, rabbis that give rulings, they write that in one room, you don't need that. As long as they see each other, or if there's a shamish, they're in the same room, that should be enough to join them together. He brings from the Gra, and the same thing, that this seems to be the opinion of the Gra, he says. And then he mentions that if there's a road in between, that would be a problem to join two houses. And the Mishnah Berurah brings that it doesn't have to be a road regarding the laws of Shabbos, even if it's not a 16 amma, which means 32 feet or maybe 24 feet. It doesn't have to be such a road, even if it's just a pathway that interrupts the two, that separates between the two houses. It could create a problem. He's questions if it has to be all year round a pathway, or even if it's just a pathway in the summer. Maybe that's good enough. That's enough to ruin the zimun. But bottom line is, you should, if you want to join two houses, there shouldn't be some type of a path between the two houses that seem that people pass through. Now,
Rabbi?
Yes.
Regarding the shames, we learned earlier in a different Mishnah, I guess, that if two ate and wanted the shames to do the zimun with them, he had to eat. He had to eat at least kezayit. He cannot just because he sees them. But here they say just because he sees them.
So this is what's interesting here, is that the shamish is not being counted towards the zimun. He is simply uniting the two groups. He's not counting towards the zimun. It doesn't say that he's one of the 10 people for the zimun. But all he's doing here is causing the two groups to be considered like one group because he's one shamish.
He's enabling them to join.
He is just the glue.
He's the glue.
He's enabling them to join, that's all.
That's why yesterday I mentioned, I was thinking, does the fact that there's one waiter who's waiting on both of them, he's joining them together. Does he have to be a man? Does he have to be Jewish? Does he have, you know what I mean? Because if you're looking at him just because there's one person who's waiting on the different people, maybe you could say that it doesn't have to be a man. It's just the fact is that one person is causing this to be considered a communal meal.
Yeah.
You know, so this was a thought. Obviously, the simple answer is it has to be a Jewish man. That would be the simple answer. But I threw this thought that maybe there could be some leniency. Again, I didn't see any leniency, but I did throw this thought that came to my mind that if he's only the glue that's combining the two groups, you know, I'm still looking up to see if I could find anyone talk about it.
If they're not specifying that he needs to be Jewish, then
it doesn't say.
He does not have to.
Does he have to be a man? Could it be a woman? The fact
that's
that
what I'm saying. If
in other words, he's not eating.
Yeah.
So I'm emphasizing this question of mine because it's based on your point, Ben, that because this law is different, that the shamish doesn't even have to eat. So you see, we're not really dealing with someone who's participating in the zimun, really. He doesn't even have to eat. So that's my source of why I threw this thought that maybe there might be some you know, we would have to I have to look further. I did look it up. I didn't find anyone discuss it, but so the simple answer is that it has to be a Jewish man. But
maybe you will be the one to write it down.
Not at this stage, that's for sure. But anyway, but that was my thought. That was where I was coming from because of the fact that he doesn't have to eat a kazayas. So what was I mentioning here? So the final thing that I was bringing from the Mishnah Brura is that it says about this pathway, right? That if there's a Reshus Harabim, if there's a communal passage, again, it doesn't have to be regarding the laws of Shabbos, a Reshus Harabim. It doesn't have to be a communal street that fits with all the rules of Shabbos, but as long as there's some type of pathway that people use, that could interrupt these two houses, which would mean even if there's a shamish, and even if they see each other, it still messes up the joining together. Now, the idea that a person who's benching can join them together, the Mishnah Brura says because he sees both groups. So seeing both groups, and both of the groups need him, he's like a shamish that he can join them together. He's he could be the glue because he's the mevarich, he's the one blessing. So it sounds like it wouldn't work if one of the group's guys sat down on the front steps and decides I'm joining everyone together. That doesn't work. But if he's the one benching, they all need him. Therefore, he could join the group together. And then regarding this, the rule of they have to hear the zimun and they have to listen. So the Mishnah Brura brings down this discussion in chapter 2 about that I mentioned in chapter 200, where there's an argument between the Mechaber and the Ramah if you have to listen to the whole first bracha, or is it just enough to do the zimun part? Do you have to hear just the zimun part? And the Mishnah Brura brings down that really it's preferable to listen to the whole benching. And the person who's benching should have in mind everyone. Of course, we don't do that anymore, as we've talked about, that we don't have the concentration. But that is the preferable thing, is to hear, that would have been to hear everyone, to hear the leader do the benching, and not have everyone bench. Now, the Mishnah Brura says that b'diavad, after the fact, if you just heard people answering and you answered with them, it's okay to answer with them. and that would be good after the fact. The Alter Rebbe mentions very similar things, but there are a few differences. The Alter Rebbe brings in his Shulchan Aruch on chapter 195, he brings that this law that there can't be a pathway passing in between. So he brings that as well. And he brings the idea of Tosfos, that even if there's two different houses, as long as they see each other, the Shamish could be Matzaref. That's the Gemara we learned, even if he doesn't eat anything with them. So that's clearly written here in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, that even if he doesn't eat with them. And he also brings that they have to have in mind that they want to join. But if they're just sitting together and they sitting and they even if they see each other in the same room and there's one shamish, they weren't kaiveya their meal together, and that wouldn't work. They have to be considered like one, and it doesn't help the fact that they see each other and all that. It's all about kavana. They had to have kavana, the intent to join, and so he brings, even if during the bracha of Hamoitzi they decided to join, it doesn't help. Even for the Hamoitzi bracha, for sure, for the Brochos HaMazon. Now, what happens if one came and then the next group came and said, we want to join the first group? So the second group came after the first group and says, you know what, let's join this first group. Okay, there's no room on their table. Let's sit on another table. Let's sit at the other side of the room. If the first group doesn't have in mind to join the second group, the second group's intent doesn't help. And therefore, if you have a large meal where you have different tables and people come one after another, they're not all coming together. So there, it would be advisable each group should do their own zimun. And yes, Ben.
I wanted to mention that maybe somebody can use it. I happened to look into Mishnayot Meirot, Masechet Brachot, and there's beautiful pictures explaining all the sitting arrangements and all the fruits that they're mentioning, and all the other things that explain those rules. And when they said about sitting together in the same house but separate rooms, they made the room as R-shape, So one is sitting on that side of the corner and the other one is sitting in that side of the corner. Like a big room, but turning, a 90-degree
like an L.
Yeah,
like an L shape.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So, there's beautiful pictures there if somebody needs to take a look at. Mishnayot Meirot.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, we used to have a restaurant over here that had the L shape, so everyone knows exactly how it looks. But if you weren't familiar with that,
I wasn't. Yeah.
Mishnayos Me'iros. So thank you, Ben. Yeah. So anyway, the final halacha that the Alter Rebbe brings is that they have to hear the whole benching, at least the Berachas Hazan, at least the first bracha. And if you didn't hear the person who didn't hear it, the Alter Rebbe says you shouldn't answer with them. You could just say Amen. And that follows the view that you could do that in a base medrash. and he says that this is an argument. It's not so clear, and if you what comes out is if you ate together with them, so then you could say Baruch Sha'achalnu. If you didn't eat with them, you could say Amen according to all opinions. So it's a little unclear if you could answer if you didn't hear them, if you didn't hear the person, but it's an argument, and he says the main opinion is that you could say Baruch Sha'achalnu Mishaloi as long as you ate together. So the bottom line is that the law of shamash, of joining together, or people eating and seeing each other, it is brought in Shulchan Aruch, this idea. But what we're seeing here, and that's what I think what's most important about this, is that they have to have that intent. And I see it even more clear in the Alter Rebbe's ruling, where he talks about the two groups, and the second group comes after the first group. And it's a very powerful point that the first group is sitting there already, they're eating together. But the second group says, we really want to join this first group. Okay, there's no room. Okay, we'll sit at the other table. That doesn't help. And because the first group has no intent in sitting with the second group. And, they're like sitting together. And the second group cannot really join the first group. That is a very interesting halach. I have to think about this, how this works at a big Shabbos bar mitzvah, let's say, or Shabbos Sheva Brochos. We have like the main popular guys. They get the first table, and they're very satisfied sitting along with each other. They're all sitting together. And then a group comes later, and they're not really so popular. They're not such a, so they, like the first group doesn't really care to sit with the second group, maybe. The second group wants to sit with the first group because the first group has the big talkers. They're schmoozers. So I'm just thinking in a practical, how sometimes this happens. Would you say that the first group doesn't really have or you could say maybe they don't care to eat with the second group, but the second group wants to eat with the first group. Or maybe you'll say, well, it's a bar mitzvah. They come to join the whole bar mitzvah. I guess you would probably say that they're coming to join the whole bar mitzvah. So therefore, it would make sense they could all join together. That's what it would seem, that they're coming really to join the bar mitzvah. Everyone's planning on eating with each other. I guess this would be more practical. I guess the practical application of it would be more if you're going to a restaurant and you see some people that maybe you would want to join them, but you can't, and they're not like so excited to join you. So this would be a case maybe where you would have such a thing where you're not intending to join together. So it really creates a question how this works in a restaurant. You have a shamash joining, let's say there's one waiter that's serving everyone, like, especially now with the recession coming, all the inflation going on. So you have, let's say, one waiter waiting on everyone. So you see each other, let's say, in the restaurant. How would this play a role practically in our, you go to a restaurant, would you be able to join a zimun sitting at a different table? This could be problematic. Based on this chapter 195, it would just, if you're at the same table, that's another story. But if you're at a different table, it would seem to me like it could be a problem joining others in a zimun where you didn't really have in mind to sit together. You're sort of just rushing to get, to eat your meal and get out of there. And you're not really having in mind to join others with your meal. So if you're at the same table, maybe that's considered like a kvios. I don't know, that I have to look up, but it would seem maybe you could. I think we looked it up once before in the Piskei Tshuvos. I think we found a source that would be okay. And so I believe that would be fine. But if you're at a different table, I'm guessing based on this chapter 195 that it would be a problem. Okay, So this is the first thing that I wanted to talk about. The second thing I wanted to talk about is we started talking about throwing bread, and the Gemara that we're learning, we're in the midst of learning, is mentions this issue about throwing bread, and person is not allowed to throw bread, and the Gemara gets into if it will get dirty and ruined or not. The Gemara does discuss that, and there's question if the Gemara is talking about all other food when it talks about that, or does bread fall into that same category? In other words, Tosfos learns that bread you can't throw, even if it will not become ruined. You cannot throw bread. That's the way Tosfos. That's how Tosfos holds, and the other commentaries seem to put bread in the same category as food, and that it would depend on getting ruined and damaged. And according to Tosfos, what comes out is throwing the bread from one table to another, from one side of the table to another, will be prohibited, because even if it's not going to get ruined, it is a problem. Now, the Mishnah Brura brings down a Prima Godim that this is a issue. This becomes an issue, especially with bread that you recited a bracha, because if you recited the bracha on the hamoitzi, on the challah, so then not only is it a bizoyon oichlin, is not only a degrading act of food, but you're degrading the blessing, because this bread, the blessing was recited upon it. So it's some type of a embarrassment to the bread, and so for sure there could be an issue of throwing bread that you recited the bracha on. And I printed a sheet from the Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's halachic renderings, and he brings this problem as his final bottom line is that a person should not throw the bread. He says, although there are poskim who justify the custom of throwing bread from one end of the table to another, one should nevertheless abstain from throwing bread completely. This applies especially to the bread eaten during the Shabbos meal that you recited a blessing upon in order to fulfill the mitzvah. In such an instance, he brings this Prima Godim that it would be forbidden to throw the bread, even according to the Rashba, who allows you to throw things that are not going to get ruined, but it would be a degrading of the mitzvah. And so he brings this. He says several other achreinim rule likewise. Summary: one should not throw the bread from one side of the table to another. One should be especially careful regarding the bread used during the Shabbos meal, upon which one recites the hamoitzi blessing. So sounds from there like that's a done deal, like that's the final say. However, I did find that there's more on the subject. It's not as simple as it sounds, there's a sefer called Keseiros Tshuva, and he writes about his father, the Ksav Sefer, that he had a custom to throw the bread that he recited the bracha. And he says, how could this be? So he brings that he brings from a Sefer Toras Chaim, says that the table is considered the Mizbeach, the altar. And therefore, you have to have salt on the table. And because just like the altar, they salted all the sacrifices. So the table is similar to the altar, and the eating is similar to the sacrifice, to the korban. And now, what the people eat is similar to there was a portion that went to the Baal Habayis, that the Bailim would eat portions of the Kodshim Kalim, of the holy sacrifices that were sacrificed on the altar. A portion went to the owner in some of the sacrifices, a portion went to the Kohen, and then some went to the altar itself. Now, the portion you eat is like the portion that would be given to the owner. The portion you recite the bracha on is like the portion that was brought on the altar. The meat that was brought on the altar, that's the portion you say the bracha on. So again, when you're eating challah, for example, on Shabbos, so there's the first piece of bread that you get, that's the one that the bracha was recited on. That's like the portion that's given to Hashem on the altar, thrown on the altar, put on the altar, and Hashem consumes that. That's the piece that you said the bracha. Then the rest of your meal, the bread that you eat, that's like the portion that's given to the owner. So the owners get a portion. Now he says, if you look in the Gemara mentions that what did they do with the blood? The blood they threw on the altar, and the Gemara says just like they threw the blood, they also threw the meat on the altar. So he says that's the source to throw the hamaitzi, the piece you say the bracha on. The source is because it's supposed to be representing the portion that was given to Hashem that they threw on the altar, because the meat was what they threw on the altar, just like the blood they threw on the altar. The Gemara says they threw the meat also on the altar. So if that bracha was recited on the bread at your Shabbos table, that is the portion that's supposed to represent the meat that was thrown on the altar for Hashem to consume. And therefore, it became a custom to throw the bread similar to the meat that was thrown on the altar, and that is the reason why some have a custom to do it. It's actually not a bizayon; it's not degrading the food. It's actually this is actually an honor for the food, showing that it's actually like a part of a sacrifice. So therefore, it is traditional to throw the bread, at least in Sephardic homes. Now, I'm saying this thinking that Ezra is going to enjoy it, and I don't see Ezra even here. So too bad that I thought he would like this very much. But it comes out that we sort of have an understanding of why the Sephardic people, again, the Sephardic people are the ones who generally throw the bread. And this Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who was the chief Sephardic rabbi a few decades ago in Israel, he concludes that you shouldn't throw it. But it would seem to me like there is room to say that to keep that custom. And I'm not sure if Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was aware of this beautiful insight that's brought from in the Sefer Hesodros, the Shilos Tshuva, the responsa called Hesodros Tshuva, that was written by the son of the Ksav Sefer. So I'm not sure if if we could say maybe if he would have known this good source, maybe he would have retracted his conclusion. Yes, Ben.
I don't see the connection between throwing bread at somebody at the table to a korban. It's not thrown to God. It's not thrown to the owner. It's thrown to different people.
Right. So you
How
have
does
to
it become
understand.
part of the korban?
So you have to understand that the table that you're at is considered the altar. How is a table an altar? You didn't do a sacrifice on it. You're not, you're not,
But
you're not
nobody is
allowed to.
allowed to eat from the altar other than
Ah,
God.
right, right. So you have to
So-
understand that we're talking in a more spiritual terms, and it's more of a concept that just like when you recite verses about the sacrifices, it's as if you brought the sacrifices, even though you're going to say, what do you mean? I'm tameh. I can't bring a sacrifice. And I don't even know the laws of slaughtering. And I don't know how to, I'm not a kohen. I can't throw the blood on the altar. You could argue and say, what do you mean? And I'm like, I brought a sacrifice. But in a spiritual sense, it's like you brought a sacrifice. The same thing as the table. In a spiritual sense, it's like the altar, and you're doing things that are symbolic of the altar. But you're right, it's not an actual sacrifice.
I feel more like stealing it from God if it's an
Right.
altar.
Right. Well, in a certain sense, all food is like that. In fact, we had a Gemara earlier that mentioned that you're not allowed to benefit from this world without a bracha, and if you do, you're actually moyel. You're doing,
Right.
you're taking holies and using them for your own personal use.
Right.
And so that goes along with this whole idea that there are ideas of sacrifices. There is an element of sacrifices in it, even though obviously it doesn't fall into the full category of a sacrifice. Yes, Moshe.
But it almost appears as though the people are the korbanot. What Ben is saying seems to make a point. I mean, you're throwing the bread, and it makes it appear that the people that they're throwing the bread to are the korbanot.
That's if it hits them. If you throw it at their face, smashes them, then you embarrass them. Then you could make them into a sacrifice. But if you want to take it to that extent, you could say the person is the fire consuming. The person is the fire that's consuming the sacrifice. So we have to be like a fire maybe to consume it. But yeah, I don't see why you would say the person is the sacrifice. The food would be, but it's symbolic. Again, the idea is that you're doing something that's symbolic of the sacrifices, the salt. You're putting salt on the table and on the food. It doesn't mean that the food, of course, you have to be careful. The food is not an actual sacrifice, but it's symbolic of a sacrifice. So that's so anyway, this is a really interesting insight that might change this ruling here about the prohibition of throwing bread. Now, again, I wouldn't tell an Ashkenazic Jew to throw bread, but definitely wouldn't protest if I saw Sephardic people throwing the bread. It seems like they have a very interesting source that would allow them to throw the bread. Okay, so now we're going to go back to our Gemara. We're on page
Rabbi,
50. Yes.
I have a question. Isn't the throwing of the meat on the altar because there's a fire going on and there's all kinds of stuff happening with being burned, and you won't want to get too close to the altar? So according to practicality, it's safer to throw the meat onto this flaming altar rather than to get too close and get burnt yourself.
So the Gemara in Zvachim doesn't, from my understanding, it learns it from a verse, not from logic. You're saying it should be logical. We do know that the Koyanim were Zrizim, they were very fast, so maybe they didn't have to worry about getting burned. They could have theoretically put it down real fast on the altar without getting burned. And yet they learned from a verse that just like the blood was thrown, so the meat was also thrown. So it seems that the source is from a verse, not from logic. But ultimately, the fact is that it was thrown on the altar, so that would be a source maybe to throwing the bread. And I'll tell you something interesting, that according to this logic, what comes out is that you really would only be allowed to throw the bread that you recited the bracha on, but you would not be allowed to throw the bread that you didn't recite the bracha on, because specifically the bread that you recited the bracha on is similar to the meat that was thrown on the altar to be consumed by Hashem. But the bread, the meat that you give the bialim, the meat that you give to the person who brought the sacrifice, the donor, that meat was not thrown to the donor. That the kohen handed him. So that meat you wouldn't. So according to that, you really would not be allowed to throw other bread. Now, as far as I know, that's the tradition, and as well, that it's not that the Sephardic people just go around throwing bread. They specifically throw only the hamoitzi piece, if I'm not mistaken. And during the rest of the meal, I don't think they just throw the bread to each other. I think the rest of the meal, they probably pass it around. I might be wrong, but
I hope that people don't get the idea to start throwing meat at you.
Right.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if they're throwing the bread based on the idea of throwing the meat by the altar. Do they also throw the meat to their guests? Because that's more of a direct correlation or connection. So I should throw you my roast beef as I'm serving the beef. I'll throw it to you on your plate. I'm serious. I'm not joking.
No. The issue that the point you're bringing up is really has to do with that's food during the meal. That's not the food that symbolizes the meat that was on the altar. So you're eating meat, but that's not symbolizing the meat that was consumed on the altar. That's symbolizing the rest of the food at the meal symbolizes food that the bialim would eat, that the donor would get. But the food that symbolizes the meat that was thrown on the altar is the food that the bracha was recited upon. So that would answer that. Yes.
You just said that the meat that's thrown on. I forget what I was going to say. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yes, Mordechai.
And the thing about throwing the meat onto the altar reminds me that the Mayam Loay says that when Nimrod went to throw Abraham into the furnace, that each time one of the guards took Abraham and was approaching the fire, the guard died. And so what Nimrod wound up doing was catapulting Abraham into the fire.
So that was the origin of throwing the meat on the altar. Interesting. Very interesting. Thank you, Mordechai, for sharing that. So that's the original source, I guess, where the verse, of course, it's learned from a verse, but Mordechai tells us that there was Maaseh Avos Siman Labanim, that the things that the patriarchs did had ultimately had an impact later on, and that would be the reason it corresponds to the fact that they were thrown into the very, very interesting. Okay, so coming back to the Gemara in the Gemara on page 50b. So we're over here at the Tanu Rabbanan. The rabbis learned. This Gemara we did yesterday about that wine needs to have water added to it in order to be considered Borei Pri Hagafen, according to Rebbe Eliezer. And this was really from the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said this. Rebbe Eliezer says you can't recite the Borei Pri Hagafen unless you add water to the wine. And the rabbis say you can recite the Borei Pri Hagafen even if you did not add water to the wine. And so the Gemara started off telling us that a brisa that deals not only with the bracha on wine, but it also deals with the concept of washing your hands with a fruit juice or with wine. What would the halacha be? Are you allowed to wash your hands? And we learned two understandings of the Gemara. Either it's talking about netilas yodayim, the mitzvah of washing one's hands before eating bread, or it's talking about the just washing one's hands for cleanliness. Would you be allowed to with wine or with water? So let's start from the beginning again. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis learned, yayin, wine. Let me tell you where we're up to. We are about 12 lines from the top of the page. 2 dots. The Gemara starts off with the wording from the Mishnah, in mevarchen ala yayin. Don't recite the bracha on wine unless you add water to it. And then the Gemara starts with it has 2 dots, it has a tuf and a resh. Tanu Rabbanan. The rabbis learned, yayin, wine, ad shalei nasan l'seichem mayim, until you put water in it, ein mevarchen ala bari pri hagafen, ela bari pri ha'etz. You do not recite the bracha bari pri hagafen, rather you say the bari pri ha'etz bracha, because until you add water to it, it's not really fit for drinking. And we mentioned it's very strong, and it's considered like until it gets that special entity of wine, till you really could drink it with that the delicious and important dignified drink that where it would be considered special. Until then, it doesn't. The bracha doesn't change, and it originally was bari pri hagafen. Originally was bari pri ha'etz. It stays bari pri ha'etz until it reaches that special importance, and according to Rabbi Eliezer, of course. Now, in the Mishnah continues, the Brisa continues, and it says, that you also would be allowed to use it to wash your hands with for netilas yodayim, for a meal, and the reason would be because it's called mei peiros. It's like fruit juice. Now, fruit juice is considered like water. Of course, we know you're supposed to use water to wash netilas yadayim, but fruit juice falls in the same category as water. It's not a different entity like wine. It's called fruit water. So you have regular water and you have fruit water. Now, if you actually added water to the wine, it would then be called wine. But at this point, it's called fruit water, mei peiros. And this would be allowed to be used for netilas yodayim. Now, mishanasan l'seichem mayim, when you add water to it, and now you're making it fit to drink, it's going to be considered wine. Mavarchen ala bar pri hagafen, you would recite the bracha bar pri hagafen, because now it's proper wine. Ve'ein noitlin mimenu, and you would not use it for mimenu liyodayim. You would not use it for netilas yodayim, and the reason would be because wine is not acceptable to wash netilas yodayim, washing your hands. Water is, and fruit juice in Hebrew is called mei peiros, called fruit water, and in halachically, that would fall into the category of water and not a separate entity than water. I guess it makes sense chemically or scientifically. The majority of juice, fruit juice, I guess, is water, right? That's what they say. Like watermelon is like 97% water, and other juices are, I guess, a nice percentage of water in the juice. So the concept of washing your hands for netilas yodayim with juice would work, at least according to the way Rashi is learning this Gemara. And once it turns into wine and it becomes considered a new entity of wine, the entity of wine would not be acceptable to be used for netilas yodayim. Now, to wash your hands for bread is, of course, rabbinic. But the rabbis based it on a pasuk, on a verse that talks about water. It says, "V'yodav lo'shotaf shutaf b'mayim," in Vayikra, Chumash Vayikra. It says, "V'chol asher yiga by hazav." Whomever the man that's impure, whoever he touches, the yadav le'shataf b'mayim, without having rinsed his hands in the water, so the chibes the gadav rachatz b'mayim, he has to immerse his garments, immerse himself in water, and he remains contaminated until evening. So they learn from there the idea of washing one's hands with water. So again, it says over there, without having rinsed his hands in the water. So there is a understanding that the rabbis had based on that verse, that when they instituted the law of washing the netilas yodayim, that it has to be with water. And if you used wine, it would not work. And therefore, according to this opinion, Rabbi Eliezer, and the way Rashi's learning it, fruit juice would be considered like water. It would be acceptable, but wine would not. And this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. And of course, the rabbis are going to argue. Yes, David.
What about grape juice? Is grape juice, because they discuss wine. Is there any discussion of grape juice, or they didn't wait for, they just went right ahead and made wine from grapes instead of grape juice? They bypassed grape juice. That's my question.
Well, so that's a very good question, especially because grape juice would seemingly be similar to fruit juice. And so you're asking, logically, it should make sense. This is, it's sort of like a fruit juice that doesn't have the alcohol content. So why would it reach a level of that you would call it, you give it a bracha bar pri hagafen? But we know the fact is that we do give it the bracha bar pri hagafen, and so what it and the question is, how does that work with adding water to it? Like, does grape juice, would they, in the olden days, was the grape juice also so concentrated? I mean, I can't imagine that the grape juice then was, the grapes were more concentrated with their juice, like it would seem. So this is a good question that you're asking, and I'm not really sure how to answer it according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. According to the rabbis, I guess it would be a little easier, because the rabbis say, even wine, you don't add water to it. It's considered wine. It's, it would be, have the bracha of bar pri hagafen. So according to the rabbis, it's easier to answer your question. But I think Isaac wants to say something over here.
I was just going to say, they sell now light grape juice, which is really just grape juice mixed in with some extra water. You look at the Kedem grape juice. They sell light grape juice. It's a third water.
Right. But and they charge the same price.
More.
Or more. But
and I think it's also bar pri hagafen.
It is.
Lighter.
Right. But the question that David is asking is in the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, how would that work?
I understand.
And this is a complicated question, at least to my knowledge, this moment, trying to think of what would Rabbi Eliezer say with grape juice.
I'm also wondering, according to the culture at the time, did they ever make grape juice, or was just everything grapes to wine?
So the thing is that, there is a Gemara that talks about squeezing grapes and reciting Kiddush on it. and it's clearly not having time to ferment. It's within the same day. You're squeezing it, and you could say on that grapes that you squeezed, you could recite the bracha Borei Pri Hagafen. So did
I
they
would
add?
think,
Yeah.
I would think they can. But we don't remember. Back then, they didn't have refrigeration. You couldn't keep cold grape juice laying around to keep it fresh.
Right.
If it was wine, it would be good at room temperature, and it's already fermented. But you couldn't just keep grape juice laying around because it's going to rot.
Okay. So the bottom line is that the Gemara there talks about squeezing it and making kiddush right on it. So it definitely implies, like Isaac was saying, that you make kiddush right away, and you would say the bracha bar pri hagafen. So based on that, my guess is that grape juice did not need water added to it to be considered bar pri hagafen, and the fact that it was potentially that it could ferment, that allowed it to have the importance of Borei Pri Hagafen. But if it fermented, then it sort of it would. Well, this is not so simple to say what I'm saying, because according to what I'm saying, once you squeeze the grape juice, it carries with it the bracha Borei Pri Hagafen. Then when it ferments, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it loses the bracha Borei Pri Hagafen, and because you need to add water to it. So then it would get back to Borei Pri Hagafen bracha when you add the water. Now, this does not sound correct. It might fit with the Gemaras, but it doesn't fit with logic that it reaches a level of Borei Pri Hagafen and then it loses the level of Borei Pri Hagafen. So that's why it's a little complicated, your question. I'm not comfortable to say this, that it would be Borei Pri Hagafen and then it would lose the Borei Pri Hagafen, because it became wine and it needs water to be added. So I'm going to have to put that question on hold. Mitzvah Hashem will look into it.
It could well be also that the fermented grape juice was too intense to be drunk without water. But
that's wine.
Squeezing out a grape, there's no way that it was so intense you couldn't eat a grape.
Right. So the question is, so did Rabbi Eliezer hold that it was Borei Pri Hagafen and then it lost its bracha? Borei Pri Hagafen? That does seem a little surprising, that it would go down a level because it became fermented. It went down a level. I mean, maybe, but it does seem a little surprising to say that.
I agree.
So I have to think about it. Anyway, it's a good question, and my time is up already. I don't want to take up all of your time. So Zayg is